Hi friends, Molten here and welcome back to another Smith Morra Gambit video. Today I want to show you a relatively unexplored and new Smith Morra Gambit Knight Sacrifice variation, which was first introduced to me by another user on Lichess by the name of MetallicIntuition, so thanks to them. I think it will definitely catch your opponents off guard and it poses a lot of practical problems over the board. So without further ado, let's roll intro and let's take a look. Okay, so the variation of the Smith Morra starts off as follows, and after the moves knight c6, d6, bishop c4, black plays the move pawn to a6, and in the variation after castles, knight to f6, instead of playing the regular recommendation here, we can try a relatively new idea, which is knight to d5. So after the move knight to d5, black has a couple of interesting options. We'll explore his best option at the end, but we'll start off with some other obvious moves like knight takes e4, which doesn't quite work, but it leads to some great attacking opportunities for white. After the move bishop to e3, we're threatening bishop to b6 here, and it's already incredibly hard for black to stop. So one option is to go knight c5, but then after knight c5 we can play this really strong attacking option with knight to g5 heading in towards this f7 square. Now it looks like we've sacrificed all our pawns and we don't have anything left in the attack, but surprisingly enough there's a lot of gas still. For example, after the move knight to e5 here, pause the video if you want to try and spot the best continuation here for white. But otherwise here you can play the move bishop to c5. After the move bishop to c5, the idea is that if black captures back, then you can actually play this move knight takes f7. Very strong move. After knight takes f7, if king takes f7, then knight to c7 check prevents the king from coming back to e8, and then we win a free queen on the next move. And if knight takes f7, then we can throw in this really nice knight f6 check. After knight f6 check, if pawn takes, then we capture the knight. Now if the king moves up to try and protect the queen, we throw in another check and eventually the queen will be lost. Also here, if black plays the move knight takes c4, there's a really nice continuation after queen h5, attacking this pawn on f7, and if now black goes to move pawn to g6, you can actually drop the queen back to e2. And the idea is that you hit the knight and also defend it with a nasty threat. So if pawn takes the bishop, then you can play the move knight to f6, checkmate. So that's what happens after the move knight to e5. Now if black tries to move pawn to e6, we can play this move queen to h5, which is very strong, hitting the pawn on f7. If g6, we'll just drop our queen back. Now if knight to e5, we can play the move bishop takes c5, and after pawn takes, we can play this move knight takes e6, and the tactics are just all in our favor here. If captures, we can recapture the knight on e5 with a big attack to follow. So for example, after knight takes e4, it doesn't quite work here for black at all. So another option is knight to d7. So after knight to d7, we can play this very strong move pawn to e5, sacrificing a pawn in the center to open up some lines for our pieces to attack with. So after this move, let's say if black captures, then we can capture back, knight takes, and then we can play the move bishop to b3, just calmly retreating our bishop, and after the move pawn to e6, which is the most obvious response for black. Otherwise we play bishop to e3 next, threatening bishop to b6, and then we'd jump our knight into c7. Here white can play the move bishop to g5, just really pestering black's queen, annoying his pieces before he's able to get the rest of his king side fully developed. Now here we can't, black can't capture the bishop because of knight c7 check. Therefore he should play the move queen a5, and we have a draw if we want. We can just play bishop to d2 and then repeat moves, but of course we play the Smith Morra not for a draw, So in this position, another option is just to play the move pawn to f4 and attack the knight, and position gets very complicated, but it offers some really good chances here for white. So one sample variation might be bishop to a4 check, bishop come back to b3, and eventually black will have to sacrifice the exchange in order to fully mobilize his king to safety, and we get this unclear position where white definitely has his chances. So if we head back to knight to d5, since knight d7, e5, knight takes is not working, he could try the move pawn to e6. After the move pawn to e6 though, we can just follow through with the move bishop to g5. Let's say the queen moves to a5. Here things get very, very complicated, but the computer likes white's chances after the move queen to e1. And for example, one variation might continue pawn takes on d6, opening up this e file with check. And for example, if the black queen trades, then we recapture, and now black is having to sacrifice a piece back in order to avoid the check with a big attack for white. So if we go back, the best move by far is the move pawn to e6. So this is where things get interesting for white, because we don't want to take the knight on f6 because that would just remove a lot of the pressure. Instead, we play this move rook to e1 here, offering a sacrifice, and this is an idea which is quite common in a lot of other Sicilian positions, where we sacrifice a piece on d5, specifically the knight or bishop, to try and keep the king stuck in the center. So for example, if black captures, then we have the move pawn takes, and now two main options for black. So if it goes knight to e5, then we can play the move bishop to f4, hitting the knight. And just so you can see what happens, let's say if bishop to e7, we just capture the knight, and after bishop takes, we threaten the move pawn to d6 here, and it's already very dangerous for black. Perhaps just losing the piece back already after the move pawn to d6. And let's say if bishop to g4, you could play knight to e5, very strong move. Now if bishop takes queen, you can throw in the move knight c6 check, winning the queen back, and you'll be material up at the end as well. So instead of knight to e5, the critical move for black should be to play the move knight to e7. Now after the move knight to e7, white's main idea is to play this move queen to d4. This avoids the bishop pin on g4, and also puts black in a really awkward spot, because here, even though he's a piece up, the king is stuck in the center, and it's very hard to finish his development. So I feel like in a practical game, you definitely have very good chances here as white. I'll give you a couple of sample variations so you can see what I mean here. So for example, let's say black plays the move bishop to f5. After the move bishop to f5, we have a couple of options. We could drop the queen back, drop the bishop back, play bishop f4, and then perhaps attack the pawn here with queen to b4. Since black's center is completely frozen, we definitely can target the queen side a lot more here. We have other moves, of course. We have bishop to g5, which is also a very interesting move here. And play could continue rook to c8, bishop to b3, let's say bishop to g6. And the problem with this position I found playing from the black side is that it's just very hard to find moves at all, and it's one misstep and your position completely collapses as black. So for example, let's say bishop f4, queen d7, rook a d1, and let's say black plays a very natural move like rook to c5, already trying to move the king to d8 and maybe move the king across to c8 to safety. He runs into a lot of problems already with the move knight to e5, and in fact after this he might already be completely lost. For example, takes, queen takes, rook takes, and followed by d6. Another line might be h6 to try and stop bishop g5. Here we get some positions where if black tries to run with the king to d7, it never really quite finds safety on the queen side, because for example, whenever he plays b5, he always gets hit by the move pawn to a4, as you'll see. And after the move pawn to a4, you can always throw in this move queen to d3. And this is similar to a game I had in a different Sicilian position, also with a knight sacrifice, where this pawn on b5 and this king on d7 is just running into a lot of problems. And even if black eventually does win the pawn on d5, there's still a lot of attacking chances for white. For example, let's say after queen b6, bishop to e3 is already completely lost for black, because now the queen has to move and then he's losing the b5 pawn with check. So another move might be bishop to g4. This one is probably one of the better moves in the position for black. After bishop to g4, the engine actually suggests this very awkward move for white, which at first doesn't really make much sense, but then the idea is a little bit clearer if you play through. It's to sort of play against the bishop on g4. We want to play the move pawn to h3. After the move bishop to h5, then white wants to jump the knight into this f5 square. And as I mentioned a couple of times, the knight on f5 is an incredibly strong piece, and if you're attacking, you definitely want to look at this square for your knight. So a sample variation here might be queen to d7, pawn goes to h3, bishop h5. So here the queen prevents knight f5, but we can play the move bishop to g5. Let's say rook c8, bishop to b3, h6. We could capture the knight here, but that would also open up the g file and make things quite messy. So bishop d2 is definitely an option here, just to keep pieces on the board. But if you take here, taking rook g8, knight f5, here we get into like forced variations, which at the end of it, the engine thinks it's fine for both sides, but yeah, it's incredibly messy and hard to see during a game, of course. But it leads to some sort of draw like this, which is no surprise really. But of course you don't have to go into this forced variation. You could just play bishop d2 and keep the position incredibly tense, where I feel it's definitely more difficult for black to find moves than for white. So going back, I think the main line here for black is probably to play this move knight to d7 in order to play f6 and then knight to e5 and then maneuver the king to f7 square. I think this is the best option for black. And after the move bishop to f4, queen goes to b6. For example, let's say queen c3, because we want to keep queens on. We don't want to trade queens. You're a piece down in this position. Let's say black tries to run with the king with the move pawn to f6. Rook a to d1. And now, for example, if he tries to block with the knight, it's already a serious mistake. See if you can spot the winning idea here for white. Well, it's not completely winning, but it gives you a very strong attack. After move knight to e5, you can play the move knight takes e5, takes, and then sack your bishop. After pawn takes, queen takes e5, and this is incredibly hard to play black here. Most likely white will win all the material back with a big attack to follow. So for example, after rook to d1, king f7 is preferred. And here already, position is still okay for black according to the engine, but it's very difficult again to find the moves, and position is very messy after, say, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and a move like rook to e6. You could also play rook e6 first as well, and things just become very, very unclear. Most likely you'll win the queen, but black will have a bunch of pieces as well for it. So as you can see, I think this line gives white a lot of room to come up with some really new and interesting ideas. Also, it's very hard to find black's moves over the board. I feel his pieces are sort of stuck and frozen in place. So I hope you enjoyed this video and get to try it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.